Welcome to Security Token Stories, brought to you by Security Token Academy, the leading educational platform dedicated to covering and facilitating the security token industry. I'm Derek Edward Schloss, Director of Strategy at Security Token Academy. Coming up on today's episode, we have Thomas Borrel, Polymath Chief Product Officer, and Adam Dossa, Polymath Head of Blockchain. Polymath is a security token platform that aims to make the creation, issuance, and management of security tokens simple. Polymath is also the team behind the ERC 1400 compliance standard and the team building the Polymesh Blockchain, a security token blockchain that aims to bring regulatory compliance and institutional confidence to blockchain-based securities. Adam, Thomas, I'm happy to have you both on the Security Token Stories podcast. Let's jump in. I'd love to hear a quick background about your lives before blockchain, how you found your way into the security token space, and you both ended up building technology at Polymath. Maybe a little bit about that journey.
Sure. So I'll start. So I'm Thomas, Chief Product Officer at Polymath. I came to Polymath and to blockchain in general from a software background. So I've been doing product management in software for a while, and at the time I was working for a large publicly traded networking company, and we were looking at blockchains to solve some of the problems that we had internally from a software perspective. And then I got a chance to meet the founders of Polymath. I met Trevor and had really, really good conversation with him, very engaging conversation. And so, that night I kind of got home and thought, I can, there's a freight train coming. I can look at it 3 years from now and say, yeah, I thought that was really going to be very transformative. And I was right, thinking it was going to be transformative. Or I can just strap myself at the front of that freight train and just go and be a part of it. And I decided to take door number 2 and strap myself to the front of the freight train. And here we are right now.
That's great. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, so I'm Adam. I'm the head of blockchain at Polymath, and I started at Polymath around the start of 2018. By way of background, so I kind of spent the first decade or so of my career building trading, risk management, and regulatory reporting systems for fixed income, or for the fixed income desk at Morgan Stanley, and that was it's kind of based in London, New York, and Tokyo. I took around 2013. I kind of took a career break, picked up some machine learning, and started building AI systems within the kind of finance and venture capital sector. Then, the kind of interesting bit is in 2015, I fell down the blockchain rabbit hole. I think it kind of happened in the same way it happens for lots of developers. I got dragged along by a colleague to an Ethereum meetup in London, and it's really kind of like a light bulb going off in my head. I've been aware of Bitcoin for a while. Never kind of spent a lot of time looking at it, but I've been aware of it for a while, and always kind of felt it looked a bit like a solution looking for a problem. But with kind of Ethereum and this ability to deploy smart contracts or Turing complete code, and being able to manage sort of programmatic assets on a public blockchain, and for me that was kind of mind blowing. It's sort of that light bulb moment. So around 3 months later, I quit my job. I was working full time as a consultant for a number of early stage blockchain based companies, and then I think around late 2017, similar to Thomas, I met Trevor Kaverka, who's one of the founders at Polymath, and he was talking about this kind of vision around being able to record and manage real world regulated assets or security tokens on a public blockchain. And for me, that was a really novel idea. Polymath was out there, was helping to define the space, was kind of committed to building this really exciting technology. So for me, it was kind of a sort of a match made in heaven. I got to combine all of this sort of institutional experience with traditional markets and capital markets and financial products with this sort of newfound passion around open finance and public blockchains.
In 2017, we started seeing kind of a number of token projects launch on Ethereum using the ERC20 standard, essentially a common list of rules for just an Ethereum token to follow, and gave kind of these early tokens predictability and how they would function and move within the Ethereum ecosystem. As it relates to what Polymath was trying to build starting in 2017, 2018, when you both started working on the project, why was the ERC20 standard impractical for I guess, this first version of tokenized assets on, or tokenized securities on a blockchain. I guess, what did the original vision of Polymath as both a platform and a protocol look like as a result of that? And maybe you can talk about building your own library of standards for security tokens, how that kind of kicked things off with ST20, and why standards have been such a focus for your team over the last few years.
Sure, yeah, it's been a journey. I mean, if we look at our initial goal in late 2017, early 2018, it was to test the market, see what kind of response we would get to digitizing securities on the blockchain. Back then, it was clear to us that there were undeniable benefits to digitization, and the evidence was clear from other markets, as well as what we had seen through the dematerialization of assets that had taken place over the years. But the big question was, how is the market going to respond to assets that are born digital, not made digital? And so with compliance at the core of securities, and the permissionlessness of ERC20 was a fundamental issue. We needed permissioned tokens to make sure that the issuer of the asset would know who was on their cap table, for example, right? So the team started building ST20, and we went live with testnet and V1 in May. But we realized very quickly that we, as an industry, were creating friction for ourselves because we didn't have one standard that exchanges and custodians could look at to understand immediately whether their infrastructure could support the storing or trading of the asset. So we got to work and we brought 25 companies together, from exchanges to custodians to lawyers, former regulators, transfer agents, broker dealers, etc., all with one goal in mind, and that was to propose a security token standard. And in September came ERC 1400. And here we are, that was September of 2018, and here we are now, a year later, with an ERC that several organizations have already embraced as their tokenization standard. And so with that standard in hand, we can then move to the next phase, which was refining the product market fit. And a very unique chance that we have is our brand back then was already very strong. So we had a lot of companies coming to us to tokenize their assets. And today we have more than 145 tokens that have been created using our software, using our smart contracts. So with that constant feedback loop, we were able to confirm our thesis that security tokens were much better suited for traditionally illiquid assets or structured financial products. So any kind of product with capital distribution, with voting, or that required enhanced governance were a much better fit than traditional equity for them to be tokenized. So we built new modules that we and released those modules to automate capital distribution, tax withholdings, govern trading volumes, all wrapped up and combined within our implementation of ERC 1400. And during that phase, we confirmed another part of the thesis, which was that Ethereum, although a very successful blockchain, was not the best fit for security tokens. And so we've now embarked on a journey to build a security token blockchain, moving from general purpose to purpose built. But perhaps enough of the the Polymath journey, and we can sort of double click a little bit on ERC 1400. So Adam, as one of the authors of the ERC, I'm sure you can provide an interesting perspective on this as well.
Yeah, and Adam, before you do, to unpack some of what Thomas is describing, it would be helpful maybe to dive in to, as you kind of walk through ERC 1400, talk about some of the problems specifically that you're seeing. I know this is a nascent industry, and I think there's been a ton of learning. It would be helpful, I think, to hear about the roadblocks that your team has seen over the last few years and how you've been creating solutions to solve some of those tech, infrastructure, regulatory problems, just the things that have come up as you've been kind of building out this library of standards for tokenization of financial markets.
Yeah, so let me spend a bit of time talking about it. So, I think, as you mentioned, Derek, ERC20 was this really simple standard. I think if you get rid of the comments, it's around 6 lines of code. And I think everyone was kind of surprised and excited by this kind of explosion of use cases we saw around ERC20. My view on really what drove that is ERC20 is obviously simple, so there's low barrier to entry, but probably more importantly, having this standard, even though it was a very simple standard, is what allowed different smart contracts, different tokens, different dApps to be interoperable and composable. So things like DEXs and more recently all these kind of DeFi protocols can more or less sort of universally use any ERC20 token. With regulated assets, so these kind of security tokens, where we're representing typically ownership of a real world asset, ERC20, although it was useful for utility tokens, really wasn't sufficient, and there were some kind of specific areas where that was pretty clear. So things like being able to enforce compliance. So different real world assets have different types of compliance rules and transfer restrictions associated with them, driven by the asset type and the jurisdiction that the asset is issued in. Identity for any regulated asset in pretty much any jurisdiction in the world is always going to be kind of critical and central. Things like regulatory reporting, being able to work with custody providers is very important to regulators. Disclosures, how information is kind of communicated and managed between issuers and investors. So you have all these additional areas that the regulated assets needed that ERC20 just wasn't designed for and didn't encompass. So ERC 1400, as Thomas says, was a kind of an open effort to bring these advantages that we saw from ERC20 around interoperability and composability to regulated assets or security tokens. And in my mind, it's this kind of interoperability and composability which kind of enables this. It's almost like a sort of network effect for assets, which fueled this explosion of use cases. Another area that standardization is kind of critical for is around communication and auditing. So, Polymath, we spend time talking to regulators, talking to different service providers, different types of institutions, and standards can really help kind of clarify that communication, clarify that sort of education process. And by having this sort of standard framework around these security tokens, it means that whether you're a regulator or you're a credit rating agency or some other sort of financial service provider, gives you an easy framework to kind of understand an asset within and the transfer restrictions that apply to it, how it moves around, and so on and so forth. And I think that's not unique to blockchains, right? The finance industry loves standards in general. You see that with ISO standards, with ISDA standards, and all sorts of other standards which have dominated in the financial sector pretty much forever. So the ERC 1400 process itself, as Thomas mentioned, it was like a community-led effort. We have, I think, over 20 organizations involved in the so-called kind of ERC 1400 Alliance. We have a sort of active Telegram group. We've held workshops, we've done community calls, lots of discussions on different forums and so on GitHub. And also, most importantly, I think this is something Thomas mentioned, right, is that Polymath is not the only company building on top of ERC 1400. There's a whole bunch of different companies. Some on the kind of issuance space, others being exchanges and other types of service providers, all building on top of ERC 1400. So we're starting to see this sort of network effect in practice.
Got it. Yeah, I think I understand. And it sounds like that focus on standards across an ecosystem has been helpful, bringing together an ecosystem, right, at its earliest formation. And it sounds like you guys have been somewhat successful doing that with the library of standards that you're creating. I guess my next question would be, and this is probably a great transition in Polymesh, the new blockchain project that you recently announced. Where does Ethereum as an underlying blockchain fall short today, and why is it critical for the next evolution? And maybe this dovetails with this focus on standards, but why is this next evolution of security tokens, why is it critical to have a different blockchain with a distinct set of features? I guess, where is Ethereum as a chain falling short, and how are some of those problems getting solved with something like a Polymesh?
Sure. So, when you look at the architecture and design of Polymesh, they're all the result of the interaction that we've had the opportunity to have with a broad spectrum of market participants. Adam mentioned regulators, investment banks, etc. And so, throughout those interactions, what became very evident on those calls we had with big banks, institutions, large issuers, etc., was that governance was a major challenge across most blockchains. Specifically, as soon as a fork happens, the question of where is my asset immediately comes up. Which branch is my asset on? Are all branches going to survive? If I have two independent assets, one that's backed by something and what's that one that isn't, what is my legal exposure? So forklessness of the chain is a foundational requirement for a purpose-built security token blockchain. Now, when you look at blockchains in general, Ethereum being one of them, most of them were built for censorship resistance and pseudonymity. And so that, of course, is incompatible with security tokens. For any investor to acquire a security token, their identity must be known. An investor that's looking to acquire a security is going to have to go through KYC, AML, basically a series of suitability checks that will determine whether the investor's profile is aligned with the securities and whether or not that transaction can take place. And these checks are time consuming, and today they're done every time you're looking to acquire an asset, which isn't efficient. So what became very clear to us is that a purpose-built security token blockchain had to have identity built into the ledger. But now, as soon as you put identity, privacy becomes a challenge. So we needed to make sure that not only the privacy of the individuals was protected, but also their positions and trades. If I'm a market maker today and I do market making in illiquid assets, positions, trades, all of that is my intellectual property. And today I can look through Ethereum wallets and see what they hold. So having all that exposed on the blockchain is a business risk. So it was important for us to make sure that would be addressed. The last one, obviously, is compliance and building that compliance right into the ledger. So Ethereum has been a fantastic place for us to test the market, to do product market fit, build that ecosystem, build the standards. But what we've learned through all those interactions is that there are some issues. For instance, until there's a big enough supply of security tokens, the incentive to do deep analysis across all wallets isn't really there. But as soon as you have a large amount of securities that are trading on that chain, the incentive skyrockets. As an example, if you could understand the positions and see the trades of a large investment bank and then front run those trades, then you could get an edge. And so that's an obvious deterrent for any large investment bank to embrace security tokens in any sort of large scale unless they exist on a blockchain that addresses sort of those core constituents that are governance, identity, and compliance built at the core, and privacy.
I think I'm starting to understand a little bit better. I imagine there might always continue to be a number of security tokens that will want to be issued on chains like Ethereum or a Stellar or some of these general purpose public blockchains that have gained a significant amount of traction, whether it's to tap into the Ethereum protocol ecosystem, some of the dApps you were talking about, or maybe to leverage the chain security of Ethereum. I guess with the work you've done with the library of standards, ERC 1400 and ST20, I'm curious if you've thought about how you envision something like Polymesh, which seems to be a better solution for a certain segment of potential tokenizers, with Ethereum and the ST20 protocol and ERC 1400. Like if I have an issuer who wants to tokenize an Ethereum using ST20 moving forward, will they still be able to? Would they be able to migrate that security token back and forth between Ethereum and Polymesh. I guess I'm curious as to how you foresee these two parallel tracks either interoperating or not moving forward. Does that question make sense?
It does. It does. And so, I'll give you a quick synopsis, and I'll let Adam jump in and talk about the details. But we're continuing to develop on Ethereum. We're continuing to build on top of ERC 1400, and even if we were to discontinue our efforts, which again isn't planned at the moment, we're continuing to build on Ethereum. The smart contracts are still there. The code is open source. Anyone can access it, and anyone can use it. We see Polymesh as a much better infrastructure to create and trade security tokens because of the regulatory attention that security tokens have gotten. And what we're seeing is the bar is raised for security tokens, and to some extent it should be, because we're bringing to bear new technologies, we're bringing to bear new capabilities. And so what the same way you now have new asset classes that can be created that couldn't exist on paper, there's potentially new risks that could come with it. And so raising the bar from a regulatory standpoint is something that was expected of the regulators, which we see is going to put additional pressure on chains like Ethereum that were built for a completely distinct purpose.
Yeah, so that's I can definitely jump in and give my view. I think it's a really interesting question, right? This kind of question of general purpose blockchains like Ethereum versus more kind of domain specific or specialized blockchains such as Polymesh. So there's this kind of old adage that you can please some of the people all of the time, or you can please all of the people some of the time. And I think with Ethereum, with its kind of general purpose vision, aims for the former, right? They're trying to please some of the people for all of the time. They're kind of agnostic around use cases, their censorship resistance, and so on. And that's great, but it kind of implies a whole bunch of sort of trade-offs and design decisions. And what that means for a company like Polymath, sort of building on top of Ethereum, is that there are certain kind of barriers you start to hit. So we have this really sophisticated modular and flexible protocol on top of Ethereum, but we're starting to hit some of these barriers. So to kind of give us slightly more sort of technical idea of what those are, there are constraints on these sort of general purpose blockchains like Ethereum around the size of the smart contracts that you can deploy. There are constraints around, there's like an increasing escalating cost around the complexity of the functionality you deploy a smart contract. That's something we've seen across the industry, right? Where you have these, the more complex a smart contract is, the harder it is to reason about its security, the harder it is to be kind of confident around its auditing and so on. So you start to kind of rapidly hit barriers there. And there are, for something like privacy, for example, right? There's a bunch of companies doing really interesting work around private and kind of confidential transactions in Ethereum. And we're close and we've talked to many of those companies. But and in terms of like a technical achievement, it's super impressive building privacy as a layer 2 on top of Ethereum. But it comes with, if you've used any of these protocols like Aztec and so on, or these different mixers and so on, there's a really high cost in terms of UX because they're built as layer 2 constructs. The UX is often very unintuitive, can be very slow. The cost for operating some of these privacy protocols is dramatically high. In some cases, it's so high in terms of kind of gas cost that it's not practical to do on a public blockchain like Ethereum. So you have all these kind of constraints that sort of get worse the more complex the thing is. The thing that you're trying to achieve is. The other kind of aspect around general purpose and specialized blockchains is we're seeing a lot of progress and innovation in relay chains. So you have companies like Cosmos and Polkadot or Parity building relay chains whose purpose is to allow different domain-specific blockchains to communicate with Ethereum, with other blockchains, and Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain, and so on and so forth. So that's an area that we're following closely. I think it's really interesting. There are other protocols or things like Plasma, which allow various kind of sidechain protocols that allow different types of interoperability between blockchains. So that is an area that we spend a lot of time looking at. We're aware of, and we track and follow, and maybe something in that kind of interoperability, say between Polymesh and Ethereum, maybe something that is relevant. But most of those technologies, I would say, are pretty early stage. They're all either kind of in highly developmental stages, or have some fairly severe. In the case of Plasma, there are some very severe trade-offs you have to make if you want to use those types of protocols. So I see this kind of there are pros and cons, and say different types of blockchains. But really, what Polymesh lets us do is it lets us, first of all, build into layer one all of the kind of functionality, all these sort of primitives we think are so important for regulated securities. And also, there were some really intractable problems in Ethereum. The things that Thomas mentioned around finality and the mining process and so on. And obviously, whatever you do at layer two, you can't change those layer one kind of trade-offs that have been made in Ethereum. So building your own, or building a sort of domain-specific blockchain allows you to also allows you to optimize both of that kind of consensus layer, if you like, as well as the kind of what primitives the chain provides.
I think I get it. So can we dive a bit into kind of the structure of Polymesh? And we don't have to spend too much time on it, but I do think it's important to kind of touch on some of the design decisions that you guys are taking with this kind of, as you put it, this purpose-built blockchain for security tokens. From my research, it looks like Polymesh is going to have, I suppose, two major participants within the ecosystem. You've got validators and nominators. And maybe this is a good time to talk about the differences between the consensus mechanism with Ethereum, proof of work, and Polymesh's nominated proof of stake. Can you just briefly describe kind of you're changing the consensus mechanism and how that's informing some of the decisions you're making holistically for the chain, and why you're taking that approach based on the feedback you've received over the last few years operating in the security token space? And then, as kind of an extension to that, who do you envision making up these participants? Who are going to be the validators? Who are going to be the nominators? I think just kind of a very rough overview on how the system works and who you think the participants will be within that system.
Yeah, so I can definitely talk about that. So as you know, right, Ethereum is based on this proof of work consensus mechanism, and miners, who are these entities that kind of construct blocks in Ethereum, are permissionless. So anyone can join the network as a miner. Depending on what kind of hash power you bring, you'll be involved in producing blocks in Ethereum. One of the kind of consequences of that type of consensus mechanism is that you get probabilistic finality. So when you look at a particular transaction that's been included in a block on the network, there's always some probability that transaction may be reversed, and that probability depends how deeply buried in the blockchain that transaction is. It depends on what the kind of overall hash power of the network looks like. But we have seen, not so much on Ethereum, but on other proof of work blockchains. So Ethereum Classic, I think, is a good example. We have seen some block reorganizations where these transactions that you thought maybe had been finalized were reorganized and sort of unfinalized. We've seen those reorgs happen over large periods of time. I think on Ethereum Classic, it was sort of 1 to 2 days we saw reorganization. So for institutions, that's really problematic, right?
It's a little scary.
It's a little scary. I mean, frankly, for everyone, it's still scary, right? So if you're trying to settle a transaction and there's some risk that transaction may be effectively reverted in some sense, it kind of brings into question some of the utility that blockchains bring. So with Polymesh, what we're using is it's a proof of stake based consensus mechanism. It's a kind of specialization of that, which is called nominated proof of stake. And so on the kind of functional side, what it gives you this sort of absolute finality guarantee. So it's a sort of it's a consensus mechanism in a sort of BFT family, which means that if a block is finalized by through the kind of consensus mechanism, it's voted on as being finalized by a sufficient number of validators, that finalization is sort of absolute. So you don't have this sort of probabilistic aspect where maybe it can be reorged down the line. If a block is finalized, it's finalized. That's one really important kind of difference, if you like, between what we're doing in Polymesh and how other networks such as Ethereum work. In terms of the kind of the details of nominated proof of stake, I'll give a very kind of quick overview. So as you say, there's sort of two main types of actors. One is validators and the other is nominators. So validators, and I think Thomas will talk a little bit more about this, but validators are typically kind of reputable, real-life organizations who are permissioned in the case of Polymesh. So to act as a validator in Polymesh, you have to be permissioned to act as a validator. And they're required to run these authoring nodes, which are nodes that collect together transactions, put them into blocks, and also vote on the correctness of blocks produced by other validators. So also there's this kind of voting process which drives the sort of finality gadget. They would stake Poly in order to act as a validator, and their kind of incentivization. So they have an incentivization in a real world sense because they'll be reputable real world organizations. So they're incentivized to act correctly based on sort of proof of reputation. But in a more kind of crypto economic sense, there are there's block rewards, and there's slashing penalties if if your node doesn't behave in the way it's expected to behave. Nominators are pretty much every other Poly coin holder on Polymesh. Nominator's role is they help to curate that validator set. So a nominator can choose to kind of support one or more validators through staking their Poly sort of to that validator. Nominators don't sort of run nodes themselves. They could run light nodes, but they don't run authoring nodes themselves. And instead, they sort of fulfill this creation process. And as part of that kind of align incentives, they share in both the validator block rewards, but they also share in any validator punishments or slashing that happens to that validator. So by staking your Poly to that validator, it's really a statement that you believe that validator is has both the kind of technical competence, let's say, and the motivation to act, to run a kind of correct authoring node. So I think in terms of the types of organization we're looking to act as validators, Thomas, you're probably best placed to talk to that.
Yeah, so as Adam just said, high reputation validators is something we're looking for, and for us, our target is for those validators to be regulated entities across a variety of jurisdictions. And so the rationale there is, what we're building is purpose built for security tokens. The chain participants, the enabling economy of that chain, we believe should be regulated. And so that means exchanges, broker dealers, custodians could all be validators on that chain, with the consensus protocol providing security on that chain, and the fact that those are licensed entities adding yet another layer of the security for another layer of security for the chain itself. But having those regulated validators has implications on nomination, and so with regulated validators comes the need for the nominators that are going to effectively delegate their stake to those validators to go through a KYC process, so that there's a clear understanding of who is staking with whom, who is paid commissions, and so on. So there's a clear understanding of how the token flows between all the different participants, and that all the participants of that purpose-built blockchain are known to one another.
Understood. And kind of researching your materials before we jumped on to this podcast, one of the things I took away from some of the documents is kind of the mission thesis of Polymesh. And I think the line was around aiming to bridge the gap between regulated securities and open decentralized finance. One of my big questions is, why do you think regulated assets, security tokens, and things like ideas like open finance are a powerful and unique combination? We've seen throughout history, innovation can look a lot different between open networks and closed networks. And you look at some of the open finance protocols being built on Ethereum, like Maker, Compound, Set. It's not difficult to see how important these things might be in the future for something like a regulated asset. If I have dominion over my security token, I can take it to a decentralized credit facility like a Maker and collateralize my security and lever up. I guess, how are you thinking about open networks and open finance and this idea of creating open networks in light of the new Polymesh effort?
Yeah, so maybe I can start with that one. So, so DeFi and open finance, it's an area which I'm hugely excited by. I think it's been amazing to kind of see this explosive growth over the last 12 months in this space, primarily on Ethereum. I'm kind of active user of lots of these protocols. I actually get paid in DAI, which is the kind of MakerDAO algorithmic stablecoin. So I'm personally kind of invested in that sense. I've helped audit a number of these different protocols and so on. So it's an area which I'm kind of personally very excited by and very interested in. In terms of where kind of security tokens fit into this picture, I mean, in my mind, there's this kind of missing link in these current DeFi protocols, and that, today most of these DeFi protocols work exclusively with sort of utility tokens, or what I call kind of crypto-native tokens, so things like Ethereum and BTC. Our kind of long-term vision of Polymath, as you mentioned, right, is how do you marry open finance, these sort of DeFi protocols and open finance, with traditional markets, which these huge hundreds of billions of dollars or trillions of dollars of kind of capital that they exist in traditional markets. And we see sort of security tokens, these are regulated on-chain assets, as being the bridge between these two areas, right? They bring these real-world assets onto public blockchains so they can then be incorporated into these sort of open finance DeFi protocols. And when we talk about things like interoperability and composability with standards, one of the reasons to do that is that you can then build these protocols that use these types of assets. I think so that's our vision, right? So how do we get there? So in my mind, what Polymesh needs to deliver in order to kind of be to be this great sort of home, this great home for these types of open finance protocols that incorporate regulated assets. There's a whole bunch of things, right? You need to have this sort of vibrant ecosystem of quality issuers, quality investors, quality assets. That's something where we've made huge inroads in the kind of Ethereum protocol, and expect to continue to build that in Polymesh. The next is that you need these sort of financial primitives like identity, like regulated assets, like privacy and so on, baked in at the layer one. But that's great, and that gives you this sort of standardized framework in which you can represent and model regulated assets. You can manipulate them. It means that everyone's kind of has a clear idea of how those things work at a base layer. You do need to have one of the lessons we took away from the protocol we built in Ethereum. I think we've learned a ton of lessons, but one of the kind of crucial lessons is that whatever you build needs to be modular. It needs to be flexible, right? If you want your protocol to be fit for purpose globally, covering any possible asset type, covering any possible jurisdiction and investor and so on, it has to be modular. It has to be flexible. There's no way to kind of anticipate every possible combination of those things. So you have to have this modularity. You have to be able to build smart extensions that take these primitives and allow you to kind of attach asset and jurisdiction specific behavior. And then, most importantly, right, you have to have this open finance layer, right? You have to allow you have to kind of give third-party developers, not Polymath developers, but third-party developers who are out there innovating, you have to give them this ability to kind of build and deploy unconstrained dApps on your network that can leverage these financial primitives, right? That can leverage regulated assets, that they can build these super cool, exciting types of DeFi applications we've seen in Ethereum, but with these with regulated assets as opposed to just utility tokens. I think there's one other kind of important thing that makes Polymesh pretty unique in this area, and it's something that kind of Thomas mentioned earlier, and it has a bunch of implications, which is that for these kind of regulatory reasons, participants on Polymesh will all go through some sort of base KYC process. So there will be some sort of KYC process that all Polymesh participants need to go through. And what that gives you, it gives you sort of regulatory certainty, but on the open finance side, it gives you a certain amount of civil protection. So civil attacks, and the civil problem is where it's very hard to, if you have 1,000 accounts in Ethereum, it's very hard to tell if those 1,000 accounts are all owned by the same individual or if they're owned by 1,000 different individuals. And it's a real kind of heavy constraint on the types of DeFi protocols you can build, because any DeFi protocol you build in Ethereum, you have to assume could be potentially attacked by a sort of civil type process, which is why the kind of underpinning of lots of these DeFi protocols is over collateralization, because that's one way of solving this sort of civil problem of these DeFi protocols. But on Polymesh, because we have this kind of base KYC process for all participants, there should be a dramatically larger design space for these types of innovative open finance protocols, and that's something we're really excited to see emerge. Really excited to see what people kind of come up with that leverages all these sort of blockchain advantages, as well as this sort of the fact that all the participants in the network have a degree of knownness to them since they've gone through this base KYC.
Thomas, kind of piggybacking on Adam's thinking of how these worlds kind of work together, looking out a few years, what do you think a thriving security token ecosystem like Polymesh will enable? Will we see new forms of organizations? Are we going to see, more seamless on-chain M&As, new forms of access rights wrapped inside tokenized equity? How do you envision the future of the Polymesh ecosystem 5, 10, 15 years down the road if you're able to get significant traction and have folks start building on top of this? Where are we going? And what do you imagine a tokenized future will look like?
Yeah, so 1, 5, 10, 15 years is a pretty long outlook, but certainly brand new asset classes, and they're already starting to emerge. And so we're seeing those new asset classes, and I anticipate them to continue to be created over time. And we're talking about new financial structured products that have different yield, that have automated maturity, that have accelerated payments, accelerated schedules for any kind of capital distribution. And so if we fast forward 5, 10, 15 years from now, I think the sort of three core tenets that I would see are one, a market that is far more inclusive and that allows new companies to be formed, new organizations to be formed, new assets to be tokenized and have fractional ownership on. And those will vary depending on the jurisdiction you're in, depending on the country you're in. But a much greater level of inclusion into financial markets that is going to drive that vibrant ecosystem of broker dealers, of law firms, of even new participants. All those new DeFi organizations that we're seeing popping up, creating or enabling those new financial assets, and so beyond that inclusion and that vibrant ecosystem, it's those new financial products. So, What enables all this is the increased transparency of those financial products, is the automation that the blockchain brings to bear, and that allows new structured products, new future products to be created that was simply impossible to create on paper. And we've already seen that transition happen between 2018 and 2019. 2018 started as more of private placements, equity type tokens being created. And now we're starting to see those new born digital type assets in jurisdictions that had very little financial activity. We're starting to see those emerge, and they're really fueled by the reduced cost of creating the asset, trading the asset, the increased access to that asset as well, and all the automation that revolves around it.
Adam and Thomas, I've really enjoyed this conversation, learning more about your work at Polymath, building the Polymesh blockchain, how you're tackling some of these early security token challenges. I look forward to following along on the journey. Before you sign off, where can people find you both and learn more about what you're building, and what can they expect by way of Polymesh over the next year or so?
To find out more about what we do, you can go to polymath.network, which is our website. You'll have all information there. We've actually posted a roadmap for Polymesh. So our target is to have testnet in Q2 2020 and mainnet in Q4 2020. And our goal is to continue to keep everyone updated as we go. So we frequently post Medium articles to keep everyone updated on the progress that we make.
Yep. So, as Thomas says, our website has a bunch of information. We also have a Telegram group, which is sort of linked can be found via the website. And there's a whole bunch of team members who are active on that.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, thank you both for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Security Token Stories. For more security token content, visit us online at securitytokenacademy.com and subscribe to our newsletter, The Security Token Edge, which lands in your mailbox each weekend. You can also keep up with the latest security token news by following us on Twitter, Telegram, YouTube, Facebook, and Medium. Before we go, a big thank you to Security Token Academy's Platinum and Gold corporate members who make this podcast possible. You can learn more about Security Token Academy's corporate members at securitytokenacademy.com. I'm Derek Edward Schloss. From all of us here at Security Token Academy, thanks for listening.
Security Token Academy does not provide investment or legal advice. We are not a registered broker-dealer or investment advisor. Opinions expressed in this podcast are the speaker's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Security Token Academy. More information can be found on our website at securitytokenacademy.com.